All right, so let's get started. So today, just as a general introduction, my name is Adam Steckelman. I'm a senior solutions engineer with Sumo Logic. I've been here about 3.5 years. So there's a lot I know about the product and a lot I know about the underlying stuff, and we're going to go through some new and interesting things that we've developed, primarily focusing here on the Sumo Logic Global Intelligence in action. And that's going to actually force you to say to yourself, what the heck does he mean by global intelligence? So let's take a look in a little bit more depth. So if you understand that Sumo Logic is a platform as a service, or excuse me, software as a service platform, you need to understand that as a multi-tenant platform, we're bringing in data for all of our different customers, many of whom are using both CloudTrail and GuardDuty. And the thing is when you're bringing that kind of data into a central repository, yes, everybody gets to see their own data and only their own data, but Sumo Logic gets the opportunity to essentially anonymize that data coming in so that we can apply industry insights and community insights after using a machine learning algorithm to help normalize and create these benchmarks for different kinds of data that are flowing. So for CloudTrail, we're looking at security-specific data. And for GuardDuty, it's all security data, primarily focused on threats. So what are we actually getting when we've done these benchmarks, and why is it important to you? Well, for CloudTrail, the idea here is make sure I can understand how does my company's or my AWS account's attack surface compare to my peers, because if I'm seeing things that are unusual for me compared to everyone else that's like me, then I now know an area where I need to focus and prioritize my attention. I want to make sure I know where my notable events are, because again, that's also going to help me focus and prioritize. And then lastly, we're going to actually make some recommendations. So we're not just taking sort of this understanding of what is the benchmark. We're also going to apply our knowledge of AWS and our knowledge of security to make some recommendations as to what you should do for specific types of notable events. For GuardDuty, it's a little bit different. GuardDuty is focused on threat categories, and about 12 of them. And based on those threat categories, we're going to essentially create a benchmark of what are all the different threats that all of our customers are seeing. And based on that, we're going to be able to give you a comparison of what your company looks like compared to that global baseline. Lastly, we're also going to be able to give you some recommended actions. So what does that look like in action? We're going to hop into my demo environment right now. And this is a dashboard within Sumo that's focused on CloudTrail. I'm going to go through a number of different dashboards. All of these dashboards are out-of-the-box dashboards that if you're bringing in GuardDuty, if you're bringing in CloudTrail data, you simply install the app. And by installing these apps, you get these dashboards to be able to see exactly what's going on. So this particular dashboard is telling us a number of different things, the focus of which is we're going to identify and create that machine learning that I talked about earlier is actually used to help put your organization into a specific grouping of like organizations. Now, we're doing that based on 3 different variables. The variety of data that's coming in, so that's essentially based on the number of distinct services, whether it's EC2, Lambda, RDS, etc. We're looking at the velocity, which is recognizing the change rate in your environment using create, update, and delete type events within CloudTrail. And we're looking at the resource count by type, specifically here, the volume, which is not the discrete, but actually not the distinct, but actually the discrete individual services. So I'm running 965 Lambdas. I've got a whole bunch of stuff in IAM. I've got X number of RDS instances. So all 3 of those variables are combined together for each company and each AWS org to give you a view of what you look like as you relate to your peers that are of similar size, variety, velocity, and volume. The cool thing here is this right now is an aggregate of all of my AWS accounts that are coming in here, my companies, right, for the demo example. But if I want to focus on an individual AWS account, I can filter to get to that particular account. This is important because there's going to be times when I want to focus in on what the security threats are to my dev accounts and differentiate those from my prod accounts because they have a different risk tolerance. I'm going to have different security policies for each of those accounts. And I want to look at them individually as opposed to grouping them together. Now, what we do with this data, now that we know our benchmarks and where we compare to our cohorts, is we're not going to look at this data more from a security lens and say, great, we've got this data. What we want to do is we want to apply what we're seeing across the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So specifically tactics and techniques that we've identified, we're breaking down into those individual categories, right? So the discovery type of tactic, the initial access, privilege escalation, you can see them all here. There's actually a description of each of them down at the bottom. And within each of these, if you want to look at individual events that are, or individual logs that we're seeing coming from CloudTrail, so if I kind of mouse over these, you can see CRUD buckets from a public IP, you can see list instances. These are potential discovery incidents that you're going to want to look into if it jumps out at you as something unusual. Now, given how low these are compared to what the cohorts are, what my peers are, none of the discovery things are really jumping out at me as something I want to look at. However, my initial access stuff is certainly significantly higher than my peers. So these, for example, the RDS Modify Security Group or EC2 Authorized Security Group ingress to the public, or even enable public access to an S3, these are things that I may want to look into a little bit more deeply to say, hey, who's doing this stuff? Why are they doing it? And is this in fact a problem? So I've already focused in on specific CloudTrail events that are going to highlight potential areas of research. Now, I want to look at it one way through the attack framework, but the alternative is I can look at it from the perspective of a particular service. So we're now, and excuse me, I have to refresh this from earlier. We're now going to look at this particular dashboard, and instead of looking at it across the 9 different attack tactics, we're going to look at this from the specifics for EC2, for IAM tactics, for Redshift, for Lambda, for RDS, and we're going to put the individual things that are specific to those in here, essentially slicing and dicing the data and looking at it from a different lens. If my focus is only on EC2, then I only really want to see those tactics that are hitting EC2. If my focus is S3, that's where I'm going to focus. So the idea behind looking at it this way is I can prioritize and tell my Lambda guys, hey, you guys need to look at stuff that's going on within your particular support group. Now, that hasn't given you any recommendations yet, but it has given me some interesting insights into what's going on. Let's look at it again a little differently and take everything that we've learned from my account as it compares to all the other accounts of similar size. And what I want to do is highlight some recommended actions based on specific notable events. So where we see here excess permissions is a priority 1. We'll talk about where that comes from. The key thing to focus on is we're actually making a whole bunch of recommendations here as to the kinds of things that you want to do based on this particular notable event for this particular resource type. The next question you might have is, how are we prioritizing these things? And well, simply put, we're using 2 factors. One is the affected resource type, however many of those may be or how you want to group them, combined with the difference between the event count that is for my company compared to the comparable event count for my cohorts, okay? So when this number is significantly large, that will obviously bubble that up as a higher priority. Now, having seen my recommendations and seeing where we're going, maybe what I want to do is focusing on an individual entity that's having an issue that we may want to drill into, and that's where this next set of tables comes in to focus in on, hey, I was seeing stuff specific to an EC2 instance. Here it is. Here's the instance ID that I want to look at, the account ID, the region, the notable event. And look, there is a link here that I can click on, and that's going to bring me to another query that's going to show me all the events specific to these particular aspects, right? So to this instance ID, this account ID, this region, and this notable event. And from there, I can use the recommended actions to see and do more about that. That is essentially what you get from a global intelligence perspective applied to the CloudTrail data. What I want to do now is move on to guard duty. From a guard duty perspective, if you remember what I mentioned earlier, guard duty is focused on 12 different attack or threat categories with a whole bunch of different individual threats inside those categories. What we've done here from a baseline or a benchmarking perspective is identified all the different threats across all the Sumo Logic customers using guard duty to see what's the percentage of things that we're seeing for each type of threat. We're breaking it down differently to see which resource types are targeted, what the severity breakdown is, for all of the overall threats that we're seeing. And we've even got a really fun chart here or a map that shows my source and target threats or my source and targets per threat that we're seeing. So you can actually focus in on, let's grab, let's say orange one, unauthorized access, to see where that's going from and to, and you can actually see there's a whole bunch of stuff going to a couple different locations. That's kind of nice. But what's really critical for guard duty is the rare threats. Why is this important? Because one of the biggest complaints that our customers have that are using guard duty is that it tends to generate a whole lot of false positives. Now, that doesn't mean that what it's finding doesn't trigger the rules. What it means is it may be seeing things that aren't necessarily as high a priority as you might want to focus on. So how do we, Sumo Logic, tend to address that issue? That, well, simply put, by recognizing what the rare threats are and being able to give you that view of how do you compare to all the threats that are coming in, and then specifically, how do you compare against the rare threats? So let's take a look at that in action. Let's refresh this page again and give this a moment to load. And what you'll see here is, hey, here's my 7-day threat score from guard duty, and you give it a second, and you'll see that, no surprise, in the last day, from yesterday to today, I went from a 0 score to 100. It's my demo. I've got to show some interesting things, so we're going to make sure that it's got some high-risk stuff in here. That's why that popped. But what's important here is being able to see, based on the different threats, what is happening in my environment compared to that global baseline. So I've got a whole lot of recon threats coming in compared to a very, very low count of recon threats to the global baseline. So this is probably an area I want to focus in on. I've got unauthorized access type threats that guard duty's identified. That is more than what the global baseline is. And same thing with backdoor threats. I can look at this and see the high severity, medium severity, low severity comparisons. What is the breakdown of my threats compared to all of the other customers using guard duty? And I can see that very quickly and easily here. Again, just like CloudTrail, we also provide an action plan that identifies the threat purpose, the threat name, what that resource is going against, and gives you a link to go to more details. All fun and interesting things, very nice to be able to provide. One last visual I have for this in the guard duty space is looking at my company's threats, right? Both regular threats and rare threats. Now, if I'm seeing any rare threats, that's a particular problem that I'm going to want to focus in on. Obviously, if it's all threats, it's no big deal, but the specific rare threats are the ones I'm going to want to focus on. Same thing from a threat map perspective. Where are they coming from? If there's anything that jumps out at you, like Russia or China, depending on what their actual threat is at any given time, or if you're feeling particularly crazy, something's going on in the Middle East or Mexico, wherever it might be, you're going to want to actually take a look at some of those based on the IP addresses of where those things are coming from. Down the bottom on this page, you're seeing a couple of other different ways to slice and dice the data. If you remember, the global baseline had EC2, IAM user, and S3 threats. Well, I don't have any S3 threats, but I am seeing the reverse of much more IAM user threats to EC2 threats. So again, maybe that's something I want to address in more detail. The fun part about all of these threats that are coming in from guard duties, all of them can actually be utilized by the Cloud SIEM Enterprise piece to actually generate signals and insights. So if you haven't seen any of the Cloud SIEM Enterprise content that's part of what we're delivering today, feel free to hit those sessions as well. Lastly, I want to just showcase another couple of visuals that we have where we can actually trend things out and see when we've got an unusual spike or potentially an unusual drop in threats that are coming in, and we can show the threats by different regions as well. We've come up at basically the end of the time window here. If there's any questions, feel free and throw them in the chat window. If not, thank you for spending your time with me this evening, and have a great night.